Mr. Sampson, is that you? There was a mild uproar as Chatsworth demanded to know the identity of this Sampson fellow, and Rosie tried to quiet him. Finally, her father subsided, watching the industrialist suspiciously as he dried himself off, and then, as he produced a revolver from his bag, pointing it menacingly in their direction. Charlie was totally flummoxed. "I don't understand," he objected. "How—" Sampson shook his head pityingly. "How what, Charlie? It was easy enough to follow you out here. I caught the ferry from Southampton to Le Havre after you had sailed. Then I traveled by train to Marseille, where I took a boat to Alexandria. Instead of leisurely cruising up the Nile like you lot, I came to Abydos directly by train. I've been with you all the way, thanks to Max keeping me up to date." Charlie threw a confused glance at Max and then shouted out angrily, "But I don't understand." Sampson continued, "I tipped off the police about Brady to get him off our backs. Maspero took care of him rather neatly, I must say. He's languishing in a Cairo prison cell as we speak." "I'm sorry, I still don't understand," Charlie repeated. "Why follow us here secretly?" "It's quite simple, Waterman. I am after this treasure of yours. I need the money you see. My factories are almost bankrupt, and I need to do something. Your little adventure seemed like a good way of raising some cash and paying off my creditors." He paused for a moment, and then continued. "I decided to help you out so that I could grab all the proceeds for myself. You told me that you would hand the treasure over to the authorities. I couldn't allow that." Charlie was gobsmacked. "Money! That's all you're doing this for, the money." "You are a fool, Waterman," Sampson shouted. "It's not just the money. This is personal." Charlie felt as if he'd been dropped down the rabbit hole along with Alice. This made no sense at all. "Personal? What do you mean, personal? What have I ever done to you?" Sampson smiled. "Did your grandfather ever tell you the story of the soapworks, Charlie? The one he closed down?" Charlie was completely bewildered. He shook his head. "No." A sneer pulled at Sampson's mouth. "That's typical of your family, Charlie. Something as important as closing down a man's livelihood, and it was never mentioned. Well, let me tell you about it. Your grandfather ruined my family, Charlie. He claimed that his precious river through the estate was being polluted by the soapworks, so he took my father to court. After years of litigation and monstrous legal bills, we were forced to close down our soap factory. It destroyed our livelihood, and it destroyed my father, Charlie. He was never the same again. He lived a few more years, and then he killed himself, shot himself, with this very revolver as a matter of fact." He pointed it menacingly at Charlie, who edged back a little bit out of sheer reflex. "Your grandfather ruined us. That's how it's personal." Charlie was shocked. "I had no idea, but still—" Sampson ignored his interjection. "I was only a young man then, but I knew what was going on. It cost my family a fortune to fight the lawsuit, 2 long years of litigation, and," he continued, working himself up to a fury, "to make matters worse, who do you suppose was your grandfather's lawyer, hey? Well, I'll tell you. It was your father." He spared no mercy in the courtroom. Every legal loophole he could find was stacked against my family, and our reputation in the community was left in tatters. In short, your father and your grandfather ruined my family with no thought to the business my father had spent many years working hard to build up. He died before he could enjoy the fruits of his labor. Your family took him away from me. Can you imagine how that feels?" Charlie opened his mouth to speak, but Sampson rushed on. "Actually, I doubt you can, because you hate your father." "Well, I loved mine, Charlie. I loved him a great deal." Sampson's eyes were flooded with emotion, but through the tears, Charlie could see an anger that he had never seen before. It frightened him immensely. It was the anger of a deranged man fueled by emotion. Sampson continued, "I spent years building the business back up. Then I bought the hall at the auction to spite you all. But that was not enough for me. Oh no, I've been waiting for a real chance to set the record straight for years. When I read the letter your grandfather gave you, I decided to spoil it for you all." "But how? The letter was sealed," Charlie exclaimed. Sampson threw him a disgusted look. "Don't be so stupid, boy. I found the letter in your grandfather's desk drawer along with the family seal. It was a small matter to reseal it, but I couldn't figure out the puzzles myself, so I thought I would get you involved. Obviously, your grandfather's faith in you was well placed." Charlie stared in abject disappointment at the man who had once helped him, a man whom he had believed to be a friend, almost a father figure. Everything thus far had just been an elaborate plan to deceive him. Sampson had befriended him purely to further his own objectives. Charlie felt an intense feeling of sadness well up inside him. He had been betrayed in a way that he had never experienced before. He felt so lonely. "What do you plan to do now?" he asked dejectedly. Another sound of disgust from the agitated Sampson. "I plan," he responded with another sneer, "to kill you, Charlie, with this very gun, in fact." He waved it around again, seeming to take comfort in its size. "The authorities won't think twice when they find your body. After all, local nationalists are always popping off foreigners." Leaning forward, he confided, "I had originally planned for Max to do it. He's very loyal. He'll do anything that I ask him to do. I took him from a world of despair and gave him hope. He relies on me totally. Without me, he is nothing." Charlie glanced over at Max, who gave him a guilty look as he continued to stand with his shoulders hunched. Sampson had him under his spell. Sampson was still talking, a crazed look in his eye. "However, after thinking about it, I decided it would be better if I did the dirty deed myself. It will give me great personal pleasure to shoot you in the head and avenge my father." Charlie's initial horror was rapidly succumbing to anger and disgust. "Why don't you get it over with now, then?" he asked truculently. Sampson looked shocked. "Do you take me for a fool? I need you to help me get through the chambers. After all, that's why we're here. Of course, once we find the treasure, I'll take it all for myself. I'm not interested in history or anything like that, just the money. That's what makes the world tick, Charlie. Money. Your fanciful and childish ideas of adventure, truth, and all that bullshit mean nothing in the real world. You need to grow up, Charlie. Money is what makes the world go around. Never forget that. The money from this trip will make all the difference to me, and I will rid myself of a Waterman in the bargain." He grinned and gesticulated towards the boat with his gun, clearly indicating that they should make a move. "You did want an adventure, didn't you, Charlie? Come on, let's get started. I'm looking forward to seeing you do a bit of rowing, you spoilt little brat." Hurt by these last comments, Charlie reluctantly picked up his gear and made towards the boat. "You should try working long shifts in a soapworks instead of moaning about how boring life is in an office." Picking up the oars, Sampson tossed them angrily in Charlie's direction, and then he settled himself comfortably at the front of the boat, where he could easily keep his gun trained on the others. "You lot, get in and sit down." Rosie glared. "And if we don't?" Sampson shrugged and said calmly, "Then Max will shoot you. I'm not having you swim back and tell all to that gaggle of scientists." "Come on, father," Rosie said, helping her elderly father into the craft and then getting in herself. Max sat at the stern, casting off and positioning himself where he had a good view of them all. Sampson smiled happily and reached out, poking Charlie's back with the gun muzzle. "Get rowing, Waterman, and make it snappy. We've got a long journey ahead and only a few hours to do it." Charlie bit his lip, but obeyed. As he began to row, he thought long and hard about what had just happened. In the space of a just few minutes, everything had changed completely. His whole life had just turned completely upside down. This morning they had all been so happy, laughing and joking. The adventure was well on its way, and the villains were locked up in Cairo. Everything had seemed so perfect, but now, not only the adventure, but Charlie's whole life had gone terribly wrong. Sampson had upset Charlie in a way that he had never felt before. Charlie had found out something about his grandfather that he never knew. He had closed down a factory and destroyed a business. Perhaps his grandfather wasn't quite the hero that he had always imagined. Charlie had always placed him on a pedestal anyway. And what about himself? Charlie had never imagined for 1 minute that he was a spoilt brat. How could anyone think that? Max had showed him contempt over his privileged upbringing, but Charlie had never thought about it that way. Had he really been that spoiled? And above all, the words that Sampson had spit out at him, which had hurt Charlie the most, because you hate your own father. These words echoed around his head over and over, because deep down inside, Charlie knew that he didn't hate his father. In fact, at this very moment, he wished that his father was here with him. He wanted to hug him and hold him. He wanted to tell him that he did love him, and he wanted his father to hold him too and reassure him that everything would be okay. But the reality was that his father wasn't here. He was thousands of miles away in England. Charlie had alienated his father to the extent that he might never see him again. Charlie suddenly realized that he would have to face up to his problems on his own. He had spent his life blaming others for his own shortcomings. A wave of realization suddenly came over him, and surprisingly, he felt good inside. He remembered something his grandfather had once told him. The hardest thing in life is letting go of what you think is real. Charlie could see now that he had been a fool, but there was time to put things right. The journey was not over yet. Then, suddenly, the tunnel was upon them, and the blackness of the Duat yawned ahead. Rosie opened Petrie's notebook to the section relating to the Amduat, studying the verses which would show the way through the doors at each stage of the journey. Now that we have started our journey, we will encounter various puzzles along the way, she said anxiously. I'm expecting that there might be traps or obstacles of some sort. Despite his tension, Charlie smiled. It's been 4,000 years, Rosie. It's not likely that any of the ancient traps will still work. Chatsworth agreed with him. You've got a point, Charlie. No matter how ambitious the plans of man, time is always the great leveler. We may very well find that the traps have disintegrated in its grasp. Rosie was dubious, but she moved the notebook closer to her lamp and began to read aloud. The beautiful West, the one who swallows without rest, the chief of those in the netherworld. She who swallows the dead, she who frightens the souls. Sampson made a harumphing sound. What nonsense! He glared at Rosie, who returned him an equally poisonous look. If you're attempting to unsettle me, my dear, your effort is in vain. I don't believe in such things. Rosie continued reading aloud from the Amduat. The reed floats of the sky are set down for Horus, that he may cross on them to the horizon, to Herakti. The nurse canal is opened. The winding waterway is flooded. The field of rushes are filled with water, and I am ferried over. To yonder eastern side of the sky, to the place where the gods fashioned me when I was born, new and young. Sampson sneered as Rosie drew to a stop. What does all that claptrap actually mean? The first hour of our journey, she explained, is an intermediary land, which is equivalent to twilight or limbo. Here the king meets his divine companions, the gods, goddesses, solar baboons, fire-breathing Urius serpents, and so on, who will accompany him on his journey. She glanced briefly in Sampson's direction as she imagined him as a solar baboon, but he didn't see her snigger, so she continued. They offer guidance, assistance, magical protection, and strength of arms against the fiends who seek to prevent him. That's where we are now, the first hour. It ends with the gate that swallows all, the actual entrance to the land of the dead. Rosie turned to face Sampson. Sampson met her eyes with a vile smirk, but she found herself even more disconcerted by the rapidly fading glimmer of light at the other end of the tunnel, a reflection from the last rays of the setting sun on the water entrance. Night was truly falling outside the temple, and her overeager imagination began to conjure up the nightmare visions of the monsters encountered by Ra in his nocturnal battles. She shook herself mentally, scolding herself that these were simply myths, but she remained disquieted. Would they truly succeed in persevering through to the end of their journey, to find the hoped-for treasure, and just what perils might lie in wait for them along the way? She shivered and reached for her coat, only to flinch back as it was presented to her by Sampson's thick fingers. His eyebrows rose, but he merely said calmly, "No need to be unnecessarily uncomfortable, my dear," as he placed it gently in her lap and moved back to his perch at the front of the boat. "Unnecessarily uncomfortable?" she gritted, attempting and failing to match his overly polite tone. "In what way do you consider being shanghaied and menaced with guns not to be unnecessarily uncomfortable?" "It may be uncomfortable, miss, but it is definitely necessary," he replied. "Against an old man, a girl, and even worse, someone you befriended and who trusted you." Sampson was starting to become annoyed. His financial dealings and successes had accustomed him to people listening and taking notice when he spoke, usually at some length, of matters important to him, and she had paid no attention to him. "Perhaps you failed to comprehend the explanation of my motives." Surprisingly, Rosie found herself wanting to laugh. "Not at all, sir," she replied insouciantly, "but I must confess it convinced me that you are a bastard as well as a cad." Sampson's face reddened. He took a deep breath and spoke very calmly. "Perhaps, Miss Chatsworth," he replied, "but nevertheless I will have my revenge. The old squire is dead, and what better way to harm his son by destroying the grandson while garnering riches beyond imagination at the same time?" Charlie dipped the oars into the murky liquid once more, although somewhat viciously, and so they continued on, the menace in Sampson's threat hanging over them poisonously in the humid air. Chatsworth moved to light the oil lamps, attempting to dispel it as much as the looming darkness, though they barely lit the way ahead, and Max worked the rudder and adjusted the ball of twine to ensure that it uncoiled smoothly, marking their progress. The others avoided watching it, no one wanting to think about just who might or might not survive to make the return trip. Quite out of the blue, Sampson shouted out, "Did you bring my bottle, Max?" Max reached into his satchel and without saying a word extracted a bottle of 10-year-old malt whiskey, which he then handed down the boat to Sampson. "Ah, yes," Sampson childishly remarked, as he pulled open the cork and took a long, slow swig of the amber liquid. For some reason, this last act incensed Charlie, who thought about dropping his oars, yanking the Webley from its hiding place and shooting Sampson where he sat. However, he decided to wait. He had the gun. It was hidden, and only Rosie was aware of its presence. When the proper opportunity arose, he would act accordingly. Sampson peered ahead into the murk. "I don't see anything yet." Max disagreed, his eyesight considerably better. "Something coming up," he corrected tersely. "Charlie, the channel turns to the right." Charlie adjusted his stroke accordingly, and the boat slid to follow the wall, emerging into a wide area. 2 stakes surmounted by a ram's head and a jackal's head could be seen on either side of 3 intricately decorated stone doorways, which were almost the height of the low ceiling. He stopped paddling as the boat stilled, and the party stared at the gaping maws. As they drifted closer, it became clear that many of the pictographs adorning the gates were of fantastic, open-jawed, many-toothed creatures. None of them looked friendly. "The gates that swallow all," Charlie remarked dryly. Rosie nodded. "Yes, I believe the glyphs are representations of the dwellers of the threshold." There was a short silence as they contemplated the doors and wondered exactly what fate the wrong choice would bring. Characteristically, Sampson was the first to break the silence, his voice impatient. "It appears that we need to make a decision," he pointed out snappishly. Rosie sighed. "Yes, but only one of the doorways leads to the correct way through the maze of tunnels. If we take a wrong turn, We could be lost down here forever." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then Sampson shouted, "Well, we haven't got all night, girl. Which way do we go?" When she failed to respond immediately, he pointed his gun at her and cocked it. "Did you hear me? Which way?" "Sir," Max said softly, "shooting them now won't do you any good. You need them." Max was right. The little party had to stay intact, at least for the time being, to decipher the puzzles and navigate the river. For now, it was best to avoid any physical confrontation and try to wait patiently. Hard as that seemed, Sampson lowered his gun. Charlie nudged Rosie gently. "What else does the amulet say at this point, Rosie?" Her eyes were wide with nervousness, but she bent her head to the notebook again, grateful for the reprieve. She read out loud. "The presence of the scarab beetle in this first hour points out the ultimate objective of the journey, the sun's rebirth. Look, Charlie, above the doors. See the symbols there. We need to find the sun and the scarab." The current was drawing them towards the first door, and they could see that its narrow lintel contained a square, the symbol of Earth. Max then spotted a triangle over the second door, which Rosie declared was the symbol of heaven. Charlie began to ply the oars to halt their progress towards the first doorway, despite Sampson's exhortations to hurry. "Perhaps we should follow the current," he suggested irritably. "That would seem the logical thing to do." Rosie shook her head. "Logical to you, perhaps, but this is Imhotep we're talking about here. Your logic and his are not necessarily the same. I would say that Imhotep was a lot smarter than you." His cheeks darkened, and it looked like they might go at each other yet again when Charlie shouted triumphantly, "Look, over the third door! I see a circle. It's the sun symbol." His enthusiasm was infectious. "That's got to be the one," Rosie exclaimed. "Look, there is a scarab underneath as well, the symbol of the sun's rebirth." "The third doorway, then," Sampson shouted impatiently, brandishing his weapon for emphasis. "Let's get moving." He took another swig from his bottle. Charlie dipped his oars into the water, and the boat changed direction enough for it to slide into the scarab tunnel. This tunnel appeared to be even darker than the last, and the light from their small lamps barely illuminated their way forward. By common consent, they moved all but one of the small oil lamps up to the bow, where Max arranged them for utmost efficiency, and then he resumed his post at the stern, sitting so he could watch ahead but also maintain an eye on his fellow travelers, his gun held loosely, but nevertheless at the ready. As the boat continued onwards into the tunnel system, the walls of the chamber changed from plain stone to highly decorated walls adorned with carved and painted representations of ancient Egyptian life. "This is the second hour, the beginning of the actual underworld," Rosie said quietly, referring once again to the journal in her lap. "Look carefully at the paintings, Charlie. These are the fertile fields, also known as the fields of reeds in the west. They're mostly wheat fields. And look, here's a funeral procession by boat. The sun god journeys on the river that flows through the netherworld, much like the Nile through Egypt. Can you see the boats carrying other gods as they accompany him through the area? This is the field of Wernez, where the sun god grants lands to the blessed dead. Crops were cultivated in this watery, fertile region, as indicated by the sheaves of wheat and the 2 large ears of grain in the boat ending in cobra heads. After concentrating silently for some time, she announced, "We should now pass through an abundant watery world which represents the underground river Nile." "This is all pretty easy so far," Sampson remarked casually, slurping another mouthful of his whiskey. There was a faint, growling sound from up ahead. "I wouldn't count your chickens just yet," Charlie replied, his voice barely heard over the increasing sound of rushing water in the distance. Max tensed, and he leaned forward, peering ahead into the dimness, but even his sharp eyes were unable to make out anything. After a few anxious minutes, the source of the noise appeared, and they could see water pouring into the tunnel from circular spouts in the ceiling and the walls, sucking the boat this way and that underneath the waterspouts. Charlie and Rosie exchanged a quick look. Could they have been wrong? Had they misunderstood the instructions and chosen the wrong tunnel? Charlie glanced around quickly to see whether they could turn back, but the strengthening current quickly removed that option. It was all he could do simply to slow the speed with which the boat was being drawn towards the massive torrents of water. Now, the channel began to drop away, and the boat started to slide underneath one looming waterfall, which alone looked large enough to fill the boat completely. Charlie was beginning to struggle with the current, and he shouted out inarticulately that he couldn't hold it. Max stepped forward quickly, and grabbing one of the oars, took his place alongside Charlie. "Come on!" he yelled, taking control of the situation. Alternating count. 1, 2, 3. Now both on this side together. His army training and leadership skills took over, and they quickly found a system that minimized the risks by pushing the boat away from the waterspouts. But it was hazardous going, with the treacherous current not only pushing them towards the spouts, but undermining their efforts by threatening to suck them back under each time they came dangerously close. Sampson did nothing at all. Instead, he cowered at the front of the boat, holding his whiskey bottle close to his chest for safety, shouting the occasional command and waving his revolver around in the air. Several times the boat was drawn under or towards the spouts, only to be pushed away by the combined efforts of Charlie and Max. The dampness on Charlie's face and body was not just due to the spray of the water, and he clenched his teeth with the effort to wield his oar effectively. Somewhere to the front, he could hear a buzzing that his mind indifferently identified as Sampson's voice, bellowing instructions that he would have recognized as useless if he could have heard them more clearly. But the need to concentrate on avoiding drowning distracted him. He made an effort and blotted out all sound and even sensation, except for Max's steady count and directions, losing himself in the rhythm of chant and pull and push, and chant and pull and push, until his world had narrowed to the oar and Max's voice. Even the roaring of the water had receded, and he marveled at how intense his concentration had become. Someone was saying something, and Charlie realized that the water's howl had indeed lessened. He blinked and shook himself, turning to see Rosie's anxious face hovering in front of him. "Charlie? Are you all right? You look a bit tired." He inhaled deeply, exhaled even more deeply, and cautiously encouraged rigid muscles to relax, although he had to use more deliberate effort with his fingers, which had practically engraved themselves into the wood of the oar. "I think so," he responded, his voice a little unsteady. At Max's direction, he rowed over towards the side of the channel so they could take stock. Everyone was drenched through, and the supplies were somewhat waterlogged, but the packing and bindings had withstood the torrent, and there was no more than superficial water damage. They spent some time bailing out the boat, which had become full up to a depth of about 3 inches. However, the idea of stopping to remove and dry out their clothes was pointless in the cool, dank air, so after reassuring themselves that no one was hurt, they decided to proceed. "Well, we got through that okay," remarked Sampson. Rosie's head jerked up from her bailing out duties. "No thanks to you. You were less than worthless," she snapped. Charlie was too exhausted to tolerate any more bickering at this point. "You know," he remarked to the passage in general, "this is all truly amazing. One has to admire Imhotep and his ingenuity." Chatsworth gratefully took up the conversational gambit. "You're absolutely right, Charlie. He has used the natural resources that were available to him when he designed these chambers. Who would have thought that these water systems would still be active after all this time?" Charlie dipped and pulled in rhythm with Max, grateful for the respite, but lost in his own thoughts. There was no doubt that Imhotep had been extremely clever, but they had weathered only the first of the potential perils of the journey. What other dangers, he wondered, still lay ahead of them? Charlie pulled out his pocket watch and consulted it. Amazingly, their journey so far had taken 2 hours, but they were still on schedule, despite their encounter with the waterspouts. Charlie took charge of the oars again and rowed slowly through the next part of the underground tunnel system. "We're coming up on another series of gates, Miss Rosie," Max declared. Rosie tensed. The first gate had led them into danger, even though they had managed to survive it. They were depending again on her ability to translate, to give them the riddle and any clues as to its solution. And even then, the correct path could still be perilous. She felt a gentle touch on her shoulder and looked up into Charlie's smiling face. "I know you can do this, Rosie," he said softly. "Take your time, and you'll find the answer." She wished she could feel as confident as he obviously did, but his effort to support her was effective. She returned his smile and began to read the passage aloud. Amazingly, she deciphered both the riddle and its key with almost no difficulty. She looked up from the journal happily after only a few minutes' thought. "Charlie, I think that we need to take the middle gate this time." He nodded. "Right then." Without a moment's hesitation, he directed the boat through the middle opening and, although there was a slight breeze now blowing through the tunnels towards them, they slid through with no indication of any danger ahead. Rosie picked up Petrie's notebook and read once again from the Amduat. "In the 3rd hour of the journey, we will pass through more watery fields and enter an area of papyrus marshes. It says here that sounds of lamentation will be heard distantly through the gloom." "Sounds of lamentation?" said Charlie curiously. Rosie continued. "Yes, whatever that means. This section of the underworld is called the Waters of Osiris. Look, you can see fantastic carvings on the walls." Around them, they could make out several rows of carvings inscribed into the rock. In the upper row, baboons were depicted, as well as the jackal-headed god Anubis, and there were other gods who rejoiced over the light that the sun had brought them. The seated Osiris, lord of the underworld, appeared in the lower row, preceded by a cluster of bird-headed gods. With knives in their hands, they stood ready to slay the enemies of the sun, who lurked in the underworld and who threatened to impede his progress. Rosie continued reading. "In the 3rd hour, mummies are awakened from the dead and reanimated in their shrines. Here also is the Lake of Fire, where the damned will meet flames. However, the blessed dead are protected from the same flames." Sampson took another swig from his whiskey bottle and exclaimed very loudly again that he thought the whole Amduat thing was just rubbish. Nobody listened. "I don't like the sound of this Lake of Fire," said Charlie. "I'll be a lot happier when we get through this section." Max and Chatsworth both agreed. Just as Charlie had spoken, the boat started to slow down in the water. Charlie rowed harder, but despite his best efforts at the oars, they made only slow progress forward. Charlie shone the light of one of the lamps down into the water and discovered that they had entered a patch of thick papyrus reeds. The thick tangle of reeds was slowing them down considerably. At almost the same moment, a high-pitched scream echoed throughout the caves, its source somewhere down the tunnel ahead of them. Charlie froze. He looked at Chatsworth and Rosie and saw fear in their eyes. "What on earth was that?" he exclaimed nervously. For a moment the boat was silent, and then another eerie wail pierced the air. Rosie cast a concerned look at Charlie as they both pondered the source of the godforsaken screams. "There must be a logical explanation," said Chatsworth shakily. "There can't be any ancient spirits down here, right?" "Of course not," answered Max. "What was that you said about mummies, though, miss?" Rosie read again the section about mummies and their reanimation from their shrines. It did little to avail their fears. They all imagined mummies coming down the tunnel, reanimated from their long sleep and chanting the lamentations of the dead. At last it was Charlie who came up with a logical explanation for the weird noises. "It must be the wind," he exclaimed. "The wind blowing through the tunnels. Yes, that's what it is." I wouldn't be surprised if Imhotep designed this part of the tunnel so that the wind makes a weird noise to frighten off tomb robbers. He did a bloody good job of frightening me, exclaimed Rosie with a smile, just as another shriek echoed around them. This time they listened a little more intently, and they could now determine that it did sound mildly wind-like. "I told you so," said Charlie in a relieved voice. "It's just the wind, that's all. No reanimated mummies here. Of course, I knew all along it would be Imhotep's doing." Rosie threw him a knowing glance, and they both burst into a giggle. Sampson said nothing. Charlie and Max pushed the boat through the tangle of reeds using the oars as barge poles, ignoring the eerie shrieks that repeatedly punctuated the silence. They eventually found clearer water, and Charlie started to paddle onwards again. They hadn't been going for many minutes when a foul smell filled the air. To Charlie, it smelled like Mr. Sampson's motor car. "What's that on the surface of the water?" exclaimed Chatsworth suddenly. Charlie lifted one of his oars out of the murky channel and inspected the end of it. A black, tarry substance was clinging to it. It smelled awful. He slid a finger along the slimy substance and brought it up to his nose. "It smells like oil," he said. It was. They were floating on a huge lake of crude oil. Chatsworth fidgeted uncomfortably in the boat. After some moments of thought, he exclaimed suddenly, "Oil is flammable, is it not? The Amduat mentioned a lake of fire." Charlie immediately realized the predicament that they were in. They were floating on top of a very inflammable substance. The slightest spark could set it off. In the close confines of the tunnel, they would be burned to death in seconds. The boat would offer them little or no protection. He lifted his lamp up into the air and then very carefully back down towards the water to get a better look. The foul-smelling black unguent was all around them, and as Chatsworth had so rightly pointed out, it was highly inflammable. "Be careful with that lamp, Charlie," Max shouted. "Don't worry, Max. I have no intentions of setting this lot alight. However, I do agree we need to be very careful. Let's get out of here as quickly as we can." Max agreed, and they set off rowing. However, they had just started to make their way forward when the boat accidentally hit the side of the tunnel. Incredulously, a fiery shower of sparks erupted from the wall, dropping down into the layer of inflammable oil. Luckily, the oil did not ignite. "What's going on, Max? The wall is sparking, I don't believe it." Max stood up in the boat and quickly pushed it away from the wall with his bare hands. "Be very careful that we don't touch the sides, Charlie. The wall appears to be made of some sort of material that sparks on contact." As they glided past the strange rock, Chatsworth examined the stone wall in more detail and quickly deduced that it was a kind of quartz crystal, but of a type that he had never seen before. The ancient Egyptians had lined this part of the tunnel with the special quartz. The metal rubbing strip on the side of the boat had scraped on the rock, creating a shower of sparks. Another collision, and the oil could be ignited. Charlie kept the boat away from the walls as best he could, although on 2 occasions it got perilously close. After some time, they entered another patch of tangled reeds, and after heaving themselves through it, they eventually found a clear patch of water totally devoid of any oil. "That was a close one," said Max, relieved to be out of danger. "We got through, but I think that we need to be more careful in future. The Amduat is telling us what to expect. I think that we need to take the book much more seriously. In every case now it has warned us of the dangers ahead. This fellow Imhotep is a lot smarter than we thought, and his 4,000-year-old traps are still as good now as they were then. We need to be vigilant." Charlie agreed. Although they had got through the tunnels thus far, like Max, he was worried that they could easily make a wrong decision, which would send the boat down the wrong tunnel where they would be lost forever. They certainly had to keep their wits about them. Max called for a rest. "Let's pull over there, Charlie. Stretch your shoulders a bit before we continue." There was a portion of wall with a partial ledge, and they paddled over to it, wedging the oars against the ledge to keep the boat from drifting. Max immediately began slowly moving his neck and shoulders in all directions, loosening stiff muscles, and Charlie followed suit. After a moment or two, he looked around and noticed that no one else was paying any attention to them. Rosie, of course, had her nose tucked in the amduat, and her father seemed to have dozed off. Sampson was awake, but he was engrossed in studying the features of his revolver as he hummed idly to himself, sipping his whiskey. The timing would probably never be better, Charlie thought, and he slid closer to Max, who glanced at him and quickly looked away again. "Max!" Charlie hissed softly, almost under his breath. "How could you do this?" Max's neck reddened and he started to pull away. Then he changed his mind. No matter how things played out, he owed Charlie that much. An explanation, at least. "I owe a lot to Mr. Sampson, Charlie." Hotly, Charlie started to interrupt, but Max shook his head. "Hear me out, Charlie. I was out of work when I left the army, and Sampson befriended me. I was in a terrible state, an emotional mess, and heading for jail or worse. Mr. Sampson took me in and set me straight. I have a lot to thank him for." He took a deep breath and said softly, carefully, almost as if trying to convince himself as well, "Don't think too harshly of me, Charlie. I'm just doing my job." Charlie stared at him incredulously. "Just doing your job, Max? Does that include killing your friends?" Max didn't answer. "Listen, Max," Charlie continued, "I wouldn't trust Sampson as far as I could throw him. You're in as much danger as we are. Do you think for 1 minute that he is going to let you out of this? You know too much. Once we are all dead, he'll be coming after you as well." Max's shoulders hunched and his face darkened. He started to speak, but his soft voice was drowned out by Sampson's insistent, stentorian tones. "All right, gentlemen, rest time is finished. We have a schedule to keep. Let's get to it." As they began the 4th hour, the current inexplicably slowed, as if it was sluggishly pushing against some distant barrier. Max said nothing, but his face tightened, and his eyes slid back and forth faster as he looked ahead, constantly alert for the first trace of danger, no matter how small. Some of his unease began to seep through to the other travelers, and they too began to canvass the walls and what little could be seen in the dark water. Even Sampson picked it up, his gun hand wavering restlessly, as if ready to shoot at anything which might appear. Chatsworth was making a sad attempt to appear brave, but his nerves were beginning to get the best of him. He mumbled something as Charlie turned, distracted by the old man's movements. "I'm sorry, sir. Did you say something?" Charlie asked. Chatsworth flashed him a frightened look. "There's an odd smell here, Charlie. Reminds me of the snake house at the zoo. I don't like snakes. Can't abide them." Charlie couldn't say that he blamed the other man. Snakes weren't exactly high on his list of favorite animals either. "I can't see there being any snakes down here, sir. Don't you worry." He glanced over at Rosie to smile at her, but the look on her face was strained, and she was having trouble meeting his gaze. "What is it, Rosie?" he asked, trying to sound reassuring. She bit her lip, clearly reluctant to speak. "Well, assuming that we chose correctly at the gate that swallows all, the 4th hour is the realm of Sokar, the god of the underworld. Sokar was associated with the serpent, often depicted as many-headed like the Hydra, which showed his dominion over the underworld and all of its inhabitants." Her voice was beginning to tremble, despite her attempt to remain calm. "I'm frightened, Charlie," she admitted. "I've always been afraid of snakes." She broke off as the channel pulled them reluctantly around a bend, and the passage beyond it widened considerably. Charlie peered at the high, sandy banks on either side of the water, which were adorned by a large quantity of slowly undulating objects. He could see hundreds of snakes. A cacophony of loud, hissing sounds echoed around the chamber as they drew closer, and the sound level increased to a fever pitch. As Charlie looked harder, trying to determine just what they were facing, one of the snakes moved more precipitously, perhaps alerted by the invasion of strangers. A massively muscled, sinuous length of shiny scales unwound, and a disconcertingly large head reared up. It was a huge, venomous snake. Eyes like hard golden agates gazed coldly at them, and a forked tongue slowly emerged from the triangular head, almost as if the beast was taking their measure. Max's voice floated back towards them. He could see the water bubbling in front of them due to the mass of reptiles on the surface. It looks like there are thousands of these little bastards in this part of the tunnel system, Charlie. I'm guessing that the breeding conditions down here are ideal for snakes. With no predators, they must have multiplied over the centuries to the point now that they have overrun the place. I've seen snakes in Africa, but these are different. These look poisonous. We'll have to be very careful. Just keep calm, miss. Charlie, go slowly. The less movement they sense, the less likely they are to become disturbed and attack us. Disturbed? Odd choice of words, Charlie thought grimly. But he focused on Max's words and brought his speed down, his oars dipping with almost no sound in and out of the water as he pulled as strongly as he dared. The movement of the boat was still agonizingly slow, and he could feel the tension rising. Chatsworth's face was white with fear, and his eyes darted frantically from side to side as he sought to reassure himself. Some of the snakes watching from the sandy banks were immense, and Charlie agreed with Max that they must have originally been part of Imhotep's design, their ancestors brought in to live and breed in special chambers over 4,000 years earlier. "Careful, Charlie," Max said suddenly, as calmly as if he were asking the time. "Visitors in the water." Charlie slowed his stroke in order to place his oar more carefully. Time slowed and crawled practically to a stop as they eased their way along. The strategy worked for a few minutes, but then a steady stream of snakes began to move purposefully in the direction of the boat. Somehow the snakes knew that they needed to move en masse, and they did this now, together, forming themselves into a larger attack group. Within seconds, they had amassed to the point that the first snakes to reach the boat were pushed upwards and over the side by the later arrivals, and the water seethed with the movement, slick scales thrusting up everywhere. Max grabbed the first invaders by their tails and flung them back over the sides. Then he grabbed an oar from Charlie and started to paddle, although he no longer attempted to stroke quietly. Instead, he was now bashing snake heads and bodies right and left as the oar entered the water. Repulsed, Charlie did the same, unnerved by the solidity of the beasts as his oar thudded downwards. The Chatsworths had drawn together in their mutual terror, although Rosie's father had managed to dig out a walking stick and was flailing about, attempting to catch the snakes and flip them back out of the boat, but with little success. Rosie had tried to pick one of the snakes up in order to remove it, but one touch of the clammy skin had been enough, and, try as she might, she couldn't bring herself to do it again. She thought suddenly of Charlie's gun, but the boat was rocking back and forth too much to even think about being able to shoot accurately, even if she dared try to retrieve it. As it was, Sampson had begun shooting wildly himself, with virtually no accuracy at all, his bullets entering the water with no effect on the snakes as he shouted wildly at Max, at Charlie, at the snakes, and at everyone in general. After one wild shot came dangerously close to his arm and wholly missed the snake he was reaching for, Charlie had had enough of Sampson's marksmanship. He turned and yelled, "You'll put a hole in the boat at this rate. Are you trying to kill us all now?" Sampson said nothing, so Charlie ignored him and continued to bash at the snakes, a bizarre remote voice in his mind counting as he went. 12, 13, 14, look out, Max. He lunged forward and grabbed a snake which had somehow avoided detection, slithering up behind Max and which now reared to strike. Snapping its neck with the force of his backward yank, Charlie stood up in the boat and heaved it towards the bank. From this higher vantage point, he looked down into the water and made the chilling discovery that an even bigger swarm of the creatures now lurked just to the side, the water beginning to foam and churn with the slowly increasing tempo of their movements. He put one foot on the edge of the boat to give himself some extra height and stabbed downwards with the oar, wielding it like a lethal mechanical drill, breaking the ophidian spines with every stroke. Then another swarm organized itself and launched at the other side of the boat, sending it rocking. Charlie overbalanced, then caught himself, swayed back towards safety, and then started to slip off again as the boat's unreliable yawing prevented him from maintaining his stance. Rosie saw him teetering on the edge of the boat and screamed a high, frantic shriek of dismay. Charlie heard the scream, but only faintly, as he felt his foot slip off the side of the boat, lurching him forward, whereupon his leg slipped into the water up to his knee. Charlie dropped his oar and thrashed about, frantically trying to lift himself back into the boat. Just as he thought he would be bitten by one of the snakes, a strong arm seized him by the scruff of the neck and hauled him backwards and upwards securely into the boat. He had a brief vision of Max's hazel eyes, narrowed with the concentration and the effort of lifting him out of the water. Charlie was just about to thank Max for his superhuman efforts in saving him when he noticed that Max himself had overbalanced and was falling backwards, arms flailing, towards the edge of the boat and the swirling mass of serpents. Charlie tried to catch Max as he fell over, but the weight of the bodyguard and his momentum made it difficult to keep hold of him, and he slipped through Charlie's hands and fell over the side into the teething mass of venomous snakes. Rosie's scream echoed in his ears, along with Chatsworth's yell of concern. Charlie pushed himself to his feet, planting himself securely, and thrust his oar towards the water as he realized in horror what had happened. "Max, grab the oar, quickly!" Max started to reach for it, but flinched back, pain contorting his face for a moment, as hundreds of pairs of fangs viciously sank into his outstretched arms and legs. It was first blood, and the snakes knew it. Within seconds, he was surrounded by coils and heads, fangs glistening as they drove into his body. As Charlie watched, aghast, Max screamed out again in pain as the needle-sharp teeth of his attackers found their target. Charlie grabbed hold of Max's arm and pulled him close in to the side of the boat. "Sampson, help me!" Charlie screamed. But Sampson ignored his pleas for help. He seemed oblivious to what had just happened and showed no signs that he might give them any assistance. Fortunately, Rosie and her father came over to help Charlie, and the three of them, with some difficulty, were able to pull Max up and into the boat. Max was in a bad way. As Rosie loosened his shirt a little to help him breathe, they could see hundreds of snake bites all over his body. The venom was already starting to take effect. Small contusions were growing at each point of entry, and these were slowly turning a nasty black color. Just one bite from these little creatures might have been survivable, but Max had received too many for there to be any reasonable chance of his survival. An immense feeling of sadness filled the air, and although they were not yet out of danger, it seemed like there was no point in worrying about the snakes any longer. Rosie cradled Max's head in her arms as all three of them sat around his limp body. His arms were twitching a little as the venom took hold, and the light in those hazel eyes was fading slowly. It was now just a matter of time. Max turned and looked straight at Charlie, a strange look of satisfaction on his face. "Good luck, Master Charlie," he said quietly. "This is the best way out for me. I don't need to worry about choosing between you and Mr. Sampson now, do I?" He smiled and struggled to speak again. "I should have died on that battlefield with my mates. The last few years have been hell for me. This is the best way out, don't you think?" "No," said Charlie firmly, tears welling in his eyes. "You're going to be okay. We'll have you fixed up in no time at all. We've got some stuff in the supplies. I'm sure that we have ointment. We'll have you right as rain in no time." Max didn't reply, for he and Charlie both knew that there was no hope. Charlie started to fill up with emotion. He had become quite attached to Max over the last few weeks, and he didn't want to admit that he was dying. "We need you, Max. Don't die," Charlie sobbed. "You'll be all right, Charlie, I know that." He winked. "You're on your own now." Max grabbed hold of Charlie's hand and began to speak, slowly, almost incoherently at first, struggling with each word, but eventually managing to get out most of what he wanted to say. "Live life to the full, Charlie. Follow your dreams, but never forget that we're all the same, Charlie. We all die in the end, no matter how rich we are. That's what makes us equal, Charlie. Do you understand?" He paused for breath for a moment and was about to say something else, but the words never came, and then he was gone. There was a stunned silence all around the boat, and even the snakes paused in their thrashing. For the first time since the attack had begun, the boat sat unmolested. Charlie stared down at Max in disbelief, still expecting the virtually indestructible bodyguard to open his eyes and get up suddenly, casting dead snakes away in all directions and shouting some command to them all. The silence was broken by Chatsworth, who moved up to take Max's abandoned oar. "They're still coming, Charlie," he observed, his initial terror frozen by the recent calamity. "We should get on to safety." Charlie nodded blankly and resumed his post. Slowly, he and Rosie's father paddled with the current, which was starting finally to become stronger and pick up speed. As they exited the chamber, the snakes following them lost interest, and shortly there were only a few stragglers who were easily dissuaded from following by a few sorrow-driven, furious whacks from Charlie's oar. As he paddled along mechanically, trying not to think, the Waterton family motto suddenly came to mind: "Better kindefrende than strange kine." It certainly seemed appropriate now, as well as rather poignant. Max had indeed turned out to be a friend. He had kept them safe during their journey from England, particularly handling the Arab muggers with dispatch, and he had continued to act honorably, despite his employer's duplicity. Charlie tried to imagine the remainder of the journey without Max's solid presence, failing miserably as he tried to blink away the dampness in his eyes. Rosie couldn't stop crying either. Her father finally put his oar down and went to her, gallantly attempting to conceal the fact of his own shaking from nerves beset by terror and adrenaline. He put his arms around her and talked to her softly, trying to soothe her. Watching them, Charlie thought remotely that he should be the one to comfort Rosie, but he was reluctant to interfere, and he was preoccupied with his own thoughts. He had never seen a man die before. He thought about Max's war, and the trenches, and the Battle of Magersfontein, and what Max had said at the end. He glanced up at Sampson, who was starting to tap his fingers impatiently. Sampson might think he owned Max, Charlie thought angrily, but he certainly didn't know him, and he'd bet a day's pay that Sampson would have had no concept of what Max had meant by those final words. But Charlie did, and he intended to remember. Sampson, unsurprisingly, had reached the end of his limited patience. Time to get on, get moving. A predictable gun wave for emphasis, which Charlie ignored. Get his body thrown overboard. We can't take him with us. It will only slow us down. "Don't you care what just happened?" Rosie demanded hotly, appalled anew by the callousness of the industrialist. "He was your man. He did things for you that he wouldn't have done otherwise." Sampson laughed. Max was my employee, no more. He giggled irritatingly as he recognized his involuntary witticism, and Rosie ground her teeth. "Maybe so," she snapped, "but he was worth a dozen of you." Sampson's face hardened, and Chatsworth pulled at his fuming daughter. "Rosie, give it up. He doesn't understand. He never will." "He's right, though," offered Charlie. "We can't take him with us, but I'm not leaving him here at the mercy of those snakes. We'll find somewhere up ahead where we can bury him." They all agreed, Sampson reluctantly, and Rosie turned her attention back to the Amduat. At some point along their route, Rosie knew the ancient Egyptians' belief in measurements and judgment would prevail, and she sincerely hoped that Sampson would reap the reward he so richly deserved. She looked up at her father, who still wore a look of anxious dismay. Further along the tunnel, they came across an area which seemed to be free of snakes, and Rosie helped Charlie to dig a shallow grave at the side of the main channel. Sampson played no part in the proceedings. Charlie searched through Max's personal possessions and found a wallet and some other items in Max's coat pocket, which he put in his rucksack for safekeeping. Whilst depositing the items in there, Charlie had felt the revolver in his bag and wondered whether he should make a move on Sampson. But Sampson was now brandishing 2 guns, having quickly got his hands on Max's revolver during the chaos. He'd stuck Max's gun under his belt as a spare. "My time will come," Charlie thought to himself. Someone should say something for Max, Rosie urged. Chatsworth nodded. He cleared his throat and began to speak. He was a man of good heart and noble character, he began, as Sampson snorted in disgust. Chatsworth ignored the interruption. He may have begun this journey as a paid bodyguard, but his duty was his bond, and his loyalty went beyond mere work for hire as he paid the ultimate sacrifice to ensure the safety of his charges. We commend his soul to that which lies beyond, and ask that all who walk those paths treat him with the kindness and respect he deserves. He paused, somewhat at a loss, then whispered, Rosie, what about that bit from the Amduat? Rosie nodded. It wouldn't hurt, Father. She recited a passage from the book, adapting it slightly to better suit the situation. Noble Osiris, great Isis, please welcome this stranger to your fields and ease his journey. Let him not be found wanting at the time of judgment, and grant him speed to his well-deserved reward. Charlie turned his head and smiled at her. Well said, both of you. I think Max would have been honored. With one final gesture of goodwill, Charlie placed his grandfather's Bible in Max's hands and closed his fingers around it. He then shoveled the last spadeful of earth over his body, and Max was gone forever. Now that you've all had your opportunity to weep, shall we get on? We've still got challenges to get through, assuming your mumbo-jumbo book is correct, and time has not exactly stopped to hold your hands while you cry for Max. 3 heads turned, and 6 eyes shot poisonous glares in his direction with sadly lacking results. Charlie and Chatsworth got back into the boat. They looked over to the mound of earth on the sandy bank that was now a grave, and Charlie began paddling once more, away from the realm of Sokar and its newest inhabitant.